Good afternoon. My name's Richard. I'm happy to have Chris join us this afternoon. Second time round for us, because the last time we tried to do this, the technology didn't work, but hopefully it will stay working this time. So Chris will introduce himself in a few moments, but basically I came across Chris just by finding him on Google to start off with, and then I've actually invested in a couple of his books as well. And he ticks a couple of boxes for me personally, both on the reading side, but also there is a slight archaeology stroke history aspect to a couple of his books as well. So that ticks another box for me, because I also have a fascination with history and archaeology, not to any kind of expert level, but I certainly have an enjoyment and a fascination with it. And another thing also, I'm Southampton born and bred, so not too far away from Dorset, and have spent many an hour in the Dorset and the Jurassic Coast, including a very wet Chesil Beach when I was in geography at junior school. We did a whole thing along the beach there in the rain, I can remember. So it's an area that I reasonably know from childhood and so forth as well. So, like I say, I'm going to hand over to Chris now to do a little bit of an introduction. I think he's then got about a sort of a 20-minute talk really to introduce how he's written his books and so forth. And then he's going to read a chapter from one of his books to start us off. And then we'll sort of have an interval where we just literally have a quick chat and a few questions. And then Chris is kindly going to read a second chapter from another book. And then we'll just finish up with a few questions to finish. And again, we'll be able to answer anybody's questions as well. So please do feel free to put those in the chat, and we can certainly try and get those answered at the end of it as well. So thank you, Chris, for coming, and over to you.
Okay, it's very much a pleasure. Thank you very much. My name is Chris Oswald, as Richard said, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my talk, my reading, and chat as well. The title of this talk is called Digging Up a Good Story. And when I first came up with this title, I thought maybe I was blowing my own trumpet a bit. But then I thought, well, if I'm not going to blow my trumpet, then nobody's going to. So it's just as well I can do it. The implication being that the research that goes into a story makes an average story a good story, and particularly with historical fiction, that's very, very critical. It's this talk is a little bit about archaeology, but mostly about research of historical facts for my books. When I first started writing, seriously writing about 5 or 6 years ago, I frankly found research a bit of a bore. I was in a great hurry to develop my characters and get it on with the plot and create these people that I wanted to write about. And I didn't find the time to go down and do the research. Was a bit odd given my lifelong love of history, but I just was in a great big hurry to get on writing books. So essentially, I was trying to sit on a two-legged stool. I had characters, I had plot, and I didn't have the facts that needed to be there. Then three things happened. One is I listened to an interview with Ken Follett, who's a great literary hero of mine, not least because he writes in two genres that I write in, both thrillers and also historical fiction. He's somewhat more successful than me, but you never know. But he's a great hero of mine. And he said that when he first started writing, he also skipped the research. And he said, frankly, my books were junk. And so that thought made me think, I need to do something here. And secondly, because I've always loved history, there was a growing disquiet in my mind that I wasn't being true to myself. And the third thing that happened to change my attitude towards this was that I had a chat with my cousin, James Oswald, who is a well-known paranormal crime fiction writer, uh, uh, basing a lot of novels up in Edinburgh. And I basically asked him how he did it, and seeking any tidbits and any advice. And he came up with a few things. One is, he said, write about what you know and what you love. Write, set it in a locality that you know about and want to write about, in order to build up a following of people who identify with that area. And as I said, he's written some very successful crime books based in Edinburgh. He lives in Fife, just down the road from Edinburgh. And the third thing he said is, write a series. And that really connected with me, because I had put a lot of effort into creating characters. And then when you type the end at the end of your book, you're basically killing off all those characters. It's a sentence of death for them. So I thought, I really cottoned on to that. I went away, thought about that for a couple of weeks, and thought, well, what do I know about and what do I love? Well, history. So that was the start of me writing historical fiction. Previous to that, I'd written several thrillers with a heavy history element. Either one of the main characters was a historian trying to find something out, or sometimes there were two stories looking back at an old story, an old thing from the past. So there was always a heavy history element in my thrillers. But this was my decision to start writing historical fiction. And then what area could I write about? Well, I'd lived for 20 odd years in America, so I considered that, but there's an awful lot of books set in America. My family is Scottish. I've lived in Scotland and have a lot of emotional ties to Scotland, so I considered that, but then thought that maybe was a little bit too much copycat of my cousin, James Oswald. So then I thought, well, why not Dorset? We bought the house here in 2007 when still living in America, and came back for holidays and things. And then a few years ago, we moved back here and have absolutely loved it. So I thought maybe I would set the historical fiction in Dorset, and that was the start of what I call the Dorset Chronicles. And then I had the question about what period to set it in. And I decided to set it in the late 17th century. So the Dorset Chronicles covers the period 1685 onwards, and the full series will probably go up to about 1720, a whole generation of change and everything like that in that period of time. And I chose this period again for really three reasons. One is that I've always loved the Stuarts. Something about their fragility, the way that they ruled, but were often at total discord with the ruling families of the country, and all the complications that brought in, and disaster and dismay and so on. Secondly, I've long felt that this period, 1685 onwards, is the period in which our modern nation was forged or formed. It was formed constitutionally, even geographically, but also socially and artistically, with things like the Royal Society starting, a lot of architecture, painting, and so on. And it was also in terms of the start of empire. My contention is that the British Empire, which some people date back to Queen Elizabeth's reign and the exploitation in America and so on, but I think it really started in the early 18th century, just in this period, the latter half of this period that I'm writing about. And the third reason I decided to pick on this was that I felt it's very much overlooked as a period of time in our history. You have, prior to this, 100 years earlier, you have the Tudors, and that is very much written about. There's an awful lot of very good historical fiction set in that period, whether it's Elizabeth or Henry or whatever. And then you have 100 years later, you have the Napoleonic Wars and everything written about that, whether that's Alexander Kent or C.S. Forrester or Vernon Cornwell or whatever. But there's an awful lot of very good writing going on there. And sandwiched in between is this, I think, juicy period where I'd like to write about. So that all mulled over in my mind for a couple of weeks, and then I started writing the Dorset Chronicles. So far, there's been 4 books written, and the 5th one is due out next month. In doing that, I really rediscovered the love of research, digging up big, grand schemes, but also very minor things. So on the grand side, I was looking into the major constitutional events, the way government machinery developed and evolved at this really critical time, the rebellions, the revolts, the struggle for influence and power, and the changing classes and everything like that. But on the equally fascinating, on the minor side, were things like the development of suspension of carriages, where major advances were made, where previously you'd basically sat on a wooden board on wooden wheels and endured great discomfort, but they were making a lot of progress in this time. And things like the development of private limited corporations to make trade easier, and insurance, for that matter, to make trade of goods much easier. So the development of these things, they didn't start in this period, but they had a lot of development to bring about the modern world as we know it. And one thing in particular I had a lot of fun researching were Highland weddings, because book 5, which is, I don't know if you can see this, but All to the Sword, the book that's coming out in November, is part of the Dorset Chronicles. It's the 5th book in the series, but it's set largely in Scotland during the Glencoe massacre. And somebody up there gets married, and I had to find out how a typical Highland wedding went in those days, 250 years ago. So I had a lot of fun, 350 years ago, I should say. I had a lot of fun researching that and bringing in quaint old traditions from there. And one thing in particular I learned was the best man concept, because I'd always assumed that that was an ancient British tradition. But I discovered through that research that it's far from that. It's a Germanic import, much more recent, and it's got a very peculiar history to it. So buy my book, read it, and find out. I also, that research also got on to the actual terminology and the words. So again, in All to the Sword, book 5, I originally wrote the following sentence: Alfie Rose came clean and admitted everything to Maddie. Now, he was in love, so it wasn't hard for him to come clean and admit everything. But he couldn't, in the late 17th century, actually come clean, because that phrase, I had a suspicion about that phrase, and I looked it up. And that phrase was an import again from America in the 19th century. So nobody was coming clean in the 17th century. And I had to rewrite it. But it's that little thing there, which is a joy to get right. I'm sure I haven't got everything right by any means. And I'm hoping that people will point out errors I've made, because that means they've read the book as well. So I'm hoping I'm getting it right most of the time, at least. Historical fiction, to my mind, has to hang on something, the bare bones of real events. Otherwise, it's not historical fiction, it's fantasy. And there's nothing wrong with fantasy, but it's just not what I write. So in setting out the Dorset Chronicles, it was easy for me to start in 1685 with the Monmouth Rebellion, based in Dorset and Somerset. It was easy, and that's this book, A New Lease on Freedom, book 1 in the Dorset Chronicles. It was easy to move on to It Takes a Rogue, book 2, which is set in 3 years later in 1685, during the Glorious Rebellion, when Prince William of Orange was invited over to take the throne from his father-in-law and uncle, James II. But thereafter, I had a little bit of a problem, because much as I love Dorset, not everything happens in Dorset. Some things occasionally happen elsewhere. So I had to think around this problem. And the way I did that was that I had characters in the first book who continue throughout all the books, who were generally quite young, in their late teens or 20s, so early adult people. And that really meant that they were the sort of people who could and would travel. They're the sort of people who could and would get tied up in adventures. And they're also young and immature, so they can evolve and change as characters as time goes by. And that's fully my intention. So that opened it up for book 3, which is here, A Simple Mistake, which is largely set during the siege of Londonderry in Northern Ireland. And in fact, one of the new characters introduced in this book, who becomes a principal character throughout subsequent books, is a lady called Bridget Brown, who is a young aspiring author, and she writes what I think is a heart-rending account, first eyewitness account of the siege of Londonderry from the view of those people being under siege, and that gets published and so on. And then book 4, One Shot in the Storm, is partly dealing with the early French-Indian Wars in North America, because that's an area of fascination for me. But it's mainly, apart from the Dorset aspect of it, it's mainly people traveling out to the Battle of the Boyne and witnessing that. So the fiction weaves in with the historical fact, and it was a lot of fun scribbling down notes all about the actual the way the Battle of the Boyne was fought and won. And then book 5, All of the Sword, as I said, is partly Dorset again, because they all have a Dorset element, but partly but largely up in the Glencoe massacre, 1692, which is a really fascinating thing. To my mind, it's one of the major acts of state terrorism behind in British history. It's everybody who knows a little bit about it thinks it was the Campbells being nasty to the McDonald's, but the Campbells were actually nominated and selected to do the dirty deeds by the British government, the English government and the Scottish government colluding with them. So it was, in order to teach rebellious clans a lesson, it was actually murder committed by the state. And then the Dorset Chronicles series will continue in this vein. Ideas for the future include going back to the French-Indian Wars and the expansion of empire over there. A war at sea, I think, is a particularly interesting thing because, again, the Napoleonic era has a lot of historical fiction about the British Navy, Royal Navy being very strong and confident, but they weren't always like that. And 100 years earlier, they were very much unlike that. They were learning, they were making disastrous mistakes and learning from that. And they weren't by any means always getting it right. So I thought it would be very interesting to have an element of that in subsequent books of the Dorset Chronicles. Another area of interest is for future books is witchcraft, which had its last real flurry in the late 17th century, both in America but also in Britain, in Scotland in particular. There's quite a lot of interesting stories around there, and superstition and panic involved in all that. And then later on in the series, I intend to run with obviously the union between England and Wales on the one hand and Scotland, and the early 18th century reunion of those two countries, to try and bring in some of the politics and mercantile interests that were at work behind the scenes there. So I really feel like research was the missing element of my early books, and I covered that up with the thrillers by setting those in somewhat in the future. So, for instance, something in, I don't know, 1900 was either the law or not the law. But when you base a book in 2030, it can be, well, maybe that's going to be the law in 2030. So you've got that little flexibility. But in writing historical fiction, you don't have that. You have to get those facts right. So the third leg of my stool is now there. It's the research, and I've come to really enjoy it and really like it. And it brings out lots of things and adds a huge amount to the development of the plot. The research into the Glencoe massacre was of particular interest because it unearthed a small township or village called Actriocton in Glencoe, which is an archaeology site. It's very basic. It's earth houses, as in flimsy houses covered in earth and grass. Very basic, very elemental, Hobbit-like almost, yet very practical, because how else to keep out the cold and the rain and the damp of a Highland winter? I've set Actriocton as the scene of the Glencoe massacre. Nobody's quite sure about it, but there's conjecture that that's where it happened. And there were two other villages being undergoing archaeology in that area as well, Inverhagen and Achnachen. And in fact, Neil Oliver, the well-known archaeologist and historian, is fundraising for some of those archaeology sites. I drove through Glen Cove some years ago and found it eerie in its coldness and its feeling of something terrible had happened there. I really sensed that. It was a little bit like, I imagine, going back 20 years after Auschwitz had closed down and walking through the empty buildings and barracks and things like that, and gas chambers. On one little further point about archaeology, I went to the Orkneys this year, researching my roots, because we originally, as a family, came from the Orkneys, although we left many years ago. And seeing what the archaeologists were doing there was absolutely incredible, and it's certainly worth a visit for anybody interested in that sort of thing. Everything from Stone Age things all the way through to late medieval palaces, and sites of ritual like Stenes and Bodmar. It's really fascinating. It was a great joy in doing my research to bring in some of my Scottish family roots into the North of the Sword. So, for instance, Oldmore, a book that features an estate that features a lot in North of the Sword, is based on my old family home of Newmore. I just changed it from new to old. And Robertson, who is a key character in this, is the name of the clan of my great-grandfather. So I'd like to try and personalize it a little bit where I can. So my crowd of Dorset dwellers basically travel out to different scenarios in each book, while drama and things happen back in Dorset as well. So there's always two stories going on in each of my books, and I very much hope that you will read them and enjoy them and take it from there. Thank you very much, Richard.
Well, thank you, Chris. So, talking about the Scottish side of things, do the Oswalds have a tartan?
Yes, it's the Robertson tartan.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
The Oswalds don't.
Right.
The Oswalds are an old family from Orkney.
Okay.
And I don't think they had tartans up in Orkney.
Right.
But Robertson definitely has a tartan.
So, what does your brother think of your writing?
My brother? My brother or my cousin?
Oh, the cousin, sorry.
Oh, yes, my cousin. Because I've got a brother as well. And
oh, right. Okay.
But he's a great reader. But to be honest, I don't talk an awful lot to him about my writing, because I don't. I feel like I would be exploiting his success a little bit too much. So I go to him for advice, and I go to him with specific questions. I've never said, "What do you think of my book?" So I don't know.
So you don't know. So it's going to be a series, and you've done the 5th one's coming out next month.
Yes.
So at the moment, how many are you working on? More than one book at a time, or are you literally one book at a time?
No, I work on several books at a time, probably 4 books at a time. So at the moment, I've taken a little bit of a divergence, and I'm writing a crime series, slightly different crime series based in London, just because I wanted to prove that I could write something different. So it's got no connection with history at all. I just suddenly panicked that I thought, maybe I can only write about history, so let's try something different. So I did that. And as everybody likes a good crime story, I was hoping that that would be popular as well. But they haven't been released yet. But I'm working on the third. I've done third drafts of the first two books, and I'm working on the third one. And I've also I've written several other books. The latest that came out is a thriller. It's called God Was Bored, which is a sort of slightly mad takeover of the Roman Catholic Church, and or attempt to take it over, with lots of rivalries and difficulties and jealousies and so on. But the basic tenet of it is saying that I think the Roman Catholic Church needs to look very seriously at celibacy for the future. So there's a serious side to it as well, but it's a lot of fun, I think. And then I've written. I'm writing a final draft of a trilogy. I've done the first book, and the first book is The Stuff of Heroes, which is an alternative history book. So it's the thing that's been done quite a few times, where Germany won the war, and this is set in the 1960s, which is a very different 1960s to the one that well, we didn't live through it, but we know about, with the rise of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and things like that. This is much more of a controlled society and a fight against it, and that's a trilogy. So I'm also working on the second one of that book as well.
So keep yourself busy.
Yes.
On that score.
Yeah.
So
I love
when
writing.
did you actually start writing? When?
Well, I've always written, and but I've only been publishing books for the last 4 or 5 years. I sold my business in America 4 years ago, 5 years ago almost, and we moved back here, and I decided to write. I still have some business interests and things that keep me in a day job, as it were, but I very much like writing, and write in the evenings and weekends and in the middle of the night when I can't sleep and so on. And so it's only been the last 5 years. But having said that, I've always attempted books and always written books, and over the last 25 years, I suppose, and then put them to one side, being too busy with my business to get on and find a publisher or do anything like that. So so some of the early books were resurrections and rewritings of things that I'd done 25 years earlier.
Wow. Okay. And I imagine age and maturity helps with the rewriting, doesn't it? So what is your publishing story? Did you find it easy to find someone to publish a book, or did you self-publish to start off with? Or... No,
I'm self-published, so I published myself, and my son is a great help in that regard, because I'm not very technical. I'm not very good with computers and images and things like that. So he's been an enormous help to me in terms of the technical side of getting them published. He's also my #1 fan when it comes to reading the book as well. So that's nice. So every so often I write to an agent, but I actually enjoy the self-publishing side of things, that even if I found a commercial publisher, I think I would still self-publish some of the books, because I really enjoy it.
So you actually enjoy that whole process. It is interesting on that score. So you mentioned Ken Follett right at the beginning. Have you actually met him in person?
No, I'd like to. Yeah, he's one of the people who, the question about if you had a dinner party and you could invite 3 people.
Well, that's one of my questions I was going to ask you, but you answered it within the first sentence, basically.
Well, in terms of authors, it'd be Ken Follett and Bernard Cornwell,
Right.
and possibly also Jeffrey Archer, because he's. I've heard that. I mean, he's magnificently successful, but I've heard that he has a very positive and unique way of selling his books when it comes to literary festivals and bookshop signings and things like that. And I'd really like to talk to him about that.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned a couple of areas. Self-publishing. I know a local guy up here, Phil Muse, also had a Scottish connection as well, because he was working for Channel 4, based up in Scotland, doing various bits and pieces on the production side. And he self-published his book, all about the orphan boys, which is basically about him and his brother, because his parents died one after the other quite quickly when they were younger. The whole story there. So he started off self-publishing, and he's been lucky to actually be picked up by a publisher. So basically, that's now being republished via that route, which is quite interesting. And then I've also got another local authoress who's written several books, but she's written a couple of books on witchcraft. Because we had up in our neck of the woods, where I'm now, County Durham, there's quite a few trials of witches, and quite a few, unfortunately, were hung on the town moor at Newcastle. So she writes, I think it's 3 books depicting in that period there, about the witch hunters and things like that, which is quite interesting, because they were getting paid basically to to hunt for people, if you know what I mean. So basically, it didn't really matter as long as they had some form of. It didn't even need to be proof, really. They were getting paid per witch, if you know what I mean. So, whether you were guilty or not, you were.
It didn't matter.
It didn't matter really, because they were getting paid X amount per witch. Now, it's a fascinating era, isn't it? And that, and if you look at like Salem, and the impact on the family, and the young member of the family actually sort of condemning them in that story, for example. Because some of that was probably down to behaviour that we now describe in different ways in our modern world, but in those days it was used to target people, I think, and it's an interesting period. So I look forward to reading your take on that in due course.
Yes, I think it's a lot of potential, because there was so much mistrust and jealousy and suspicion and things like that, and that's all good stuff for an author.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I take it with COVID and so forth, much your research and so forth has been online, hasn't it, rather than actually being able to go?
Yeah. Some of the early books. Well, the first 2 in the Dorset Chronicles series came out before COVID, and those I was able to visit places and so on. But a lot of it has been online more recently. Yes, and that's
hopefully we're going to get, aren't we?
Yeah, it's a great resource. You just
can't.
It's
fascinating the amount of information there is now on the internet, one way or another, and again, just the interaction with people, also the power of it on that side. Because I have people talking to me from Canada and Australia. I get messages all sorts of time of day. it's fascinating on that score.
Yeah.
Really. So, are you all starting to get bookings for festivals and talks now physically going forward, or?
Yeah, a few talks, and 1 or 2 of the local festivals still haven't started up again. The 2 towns nearest me haven't started their literary festivals. It's probably going to be 22.
Yeah, well, we've been doing it online this year ourselves, but hoping to get something physical again next year. So hopefully a weekend sort of festival next year. Hopefully on that score.
That'd be great. Yeah,
it should be really good.
Always good to go and do a signing or give a short talk or something like that.
I think it's a nice thing to do, isn't it? It's a nice interaction with people, because you can talk on things like this, but it's not quite the same as actually seeing people in person, if you know what I mean. I wish you all the best with that.
Thank you.
So Ken Follett is one. Is there anybody else that, apart from the three people you mentioned for the dinner party, that you would like to meet at one of these festivals, that you would like to have a coffee and a chat with?
Well, there's a few people who I'd be very surprised if I found, because they've been long dead.
Right.
So, but I would have loved to have met Evelyn Waugh. I'm very, very keen on his books, and Graham Greene as well. But I've also read quite a few of David Baldacci's books and things like that. So I would love to meet a whole host of people. Yeah.
Mm. Well, you mentioned Orkney as a lovely place to have gone back to visit. Have you actually ever taken part in any archaeology digs?
No, I haven't. No, I'd never given archaeology much thought until I got into this book, really, Horse the Sword. And coincidentally, at the same time I was writing it, I did the trip up to the Orkneys and saw the massive amount going on there. And it just
amounts going up there. It's amazing. Some of the stuff that I see on a regular basis. I follow one blog, Nest or something or other, and that's all about the Iron Age and the Stone Age. It's just fascinating there. But it was amazing. You were talking about the huts and things like that. They literally were to keep the basics, wasn't it? It was to keep you dry and have somewhere to cook and sleep, basically, wasn't it? You know, no more, no less.
Yeah, dry and be able to cook, and that's basically you're needed. Yeah. Warm. Yeah.
Amazing. So, would you have wanted to have lived in the period that you cover with the Dorset Chronicles? Would that have been, if you had the Doctor Who TARDIS to go back, would that be a period that you would actually want to go and?
I think a big part of me would want to do that. Yeah, I certainly want to go back rather than into the future. But I do think that I'd find the narrow-mindedness of some people really frustrating. I think, in many ways we haven't got any more broad-minded over the years, but I think in some ways we have, and I think I would find the prejudice that a lot of people had quite difficult. I mean, like the class system, quite difficult to cope with, I think. But I would certainly love to go back and witness some of these great events. I mean, to actually see a 17th century battle going on would be fascinating, as long as I didn't get hurt.
Yes, well, you got that caveat. Yeah, no, it's been fascinating to listen to how you've gone about writing the books and so forth. Have you got a chapter you could read from one of your books?
Yeah, I'll just bring that up now, and
it'd be lovely, I think, for me and for the viewers to listen to you read a chapter if you were up for that.
Yep, I'll definitely do that. This is the opening chapter of Horse the Sword, the book.
Right. Okay. Excellent.
That's coming out in November. So, excuse me. Chapter 1, 13th of February, 1692, Glencoe. It was as if the dead crowded out the living, creating a world without balance. Just a small world, for in the next glen there was no such feeling, no sense that life gone was in the ascendancy, that what had happened could never be dispelled by either present or future, leaving nature and time as spent forces. It was as if the dead would hang there forever, never moving on, never finding that better place. 48 hours earlier, when Bridget Davenport had first arrived, it had been different. Not alone at all, but travelling with a party of friends and relations, riding carelessly into Maryburgh and staring at the mass of Ben Nevis rising above the little town, recently named for King William's wife, Mary Stuart. They had left the Old Moor estate of Percy Blades Robson, just outside Orness, 18 days earlier, making a leisurely transit along the Great Glen and arriving at the bottom of Loch Lochy on the 11th of February. 100 miles in 18 days, plenty of time to stop and converse with people along the way. Bridget had led those conversations, explaining her purpose and opening a new page of a notebook each time. The guide Percy had hired had told them to expect the newly built Fort William to dominate the scene. But other than the intermittent buzz of military activity, it seemed unimpressive to the travellers. Its wooden walls suggested a temporary purpose. In fact, the whole of the new town of Maryburgh had a wood and thatch lack of permanence. Thomas, her husband, commented that perhaps it had been built in that way so that it could easily be levelled when government policy changed and it was required no more. No, Thomas, the host, Percy Robson Blade, said, it was to get something in place quickly. They intend to build a more permanent fort this year, soon at any rate. Still, I would not have built it so, he said, looking over the scene while they paused on the outskirts, his horse sidestepping and pushing against the reins as it sensed hay and water ahead. I would have built immediately in local stone, so that the buildings were as old as the mountains around. You and your building works, Henry, Earl of Sherborne, and Thomas's brother-in-law laughed. Remember, Thomas, this is supposed to be Bridget's time to discover the Scottish people. Yes, quite right, he replied, but I just can't help it. When I see buildings, I have to analyse them. You're flush with success, brother dear, Grace said, catching up with the forward riders. You've designed a beautiful house at Oldmoor, and now, whenever you see less than perfection anywhere else, you feel an urge to speak out. Not every dwelling can be a mansion, Thomas. This was Eliza Davenport coming up next with Matthew, her husband, completing the trio of responses to Thomas's observations, and leaving nothing for Matthew, the oldest Davenport sibling, and Eliza's husband, to add. Bridget recalled the casual conversations of 2 days ago, the ribbing, the teasing from intense fondness. It made the contrast all the starker now that she was alone, outdoors, not only with the elements against her, but with the soldiers seeking her out. The same soldiers, she was sure, who had passed in and out of the fort while their party found that only Inn Maryburgh had to offer. It had been her request to travel inland before returning to the children at Oldmoor and then back to Dorset by sea, the only practicable way to cover the 700 miles between Orness and Dorset. At first, she had held out to travel the entire distance by land, reasoning that the discoveries en route would provide excellent material for a second volume of her book, covering a female perspective on their modern nations. I would so love to extend the work to cover Scotland and northern England. I could make a series of it. Her argument had some weight. The initial print run sold out within 2 weeks, and the next run, 4 times the size, was selling quickly. I need to get back to the business, Bridge, Thomas had replied as they contemplated the end of their glorious 6 months in the Highlands, guests of Henry's friend, Captain Percival Blades Robson. It was much quicker to travel by sea, much less risk as well. But Thomas's considerations about his building business had not prevailed. In truth, he was happy to extend their trip and see something of what his wife wanted to write about. Only 48 hours ago, she had been one of a party of 8, a happy gathering of friends and relatives, taking a detour before starting on their journey home to Dorset from Oldmoor. A beautiful estate with views to the Black Isle in the distance and then on to the North Sea. They'd arrived in summer, glorying in strong sunshine, taking an interest in the harvest all around them, Eliza in particular noting the similarities and the differences. They stayed through Christmas, seeing the contrast with crisp snowfall and biting winds from the east. There had been many traditions to the Christmas period, remembered and passed on by the old steward Macpherson and his wife, who ran the modest house at the centre of the estate. They both delighted in having so many young, fun people to attend after the old laird and his quiet ways. Truth be told, Mrs. Macpherson made up some of the traditions, motivated by the laughter our ideas brought to the faces of the guests. Christmas Eve had marked a culmination of events, the start of 2 days of celebrating in casual, easy form. But there'd been nothing easy about the last 2 days, and Bridget was facing it alone too. She ached for Thomas, her husband, cursing herself for stupidity, as no doubt he would be too at losing her. One thing she was certain about, however bad it was for her, it was likely much worse for Thomas. She sat momentarily on a rock, needing to order her thoughts. Remembering she still had her notebook, she pulled out the pencil from the spine, opened the book at a new page, and hesitated, trying to sum up something that would help her later, if there was a later. Finally, she wrote in her looping long letters, "Fear makes every moment stand out. It slows down time, drags out the present, stops the sun pushing the world around it and spinning out the days." She paused, chewed the end of the pencil, then wrote the reply. "Yet time does pass, marked not by the altitude of the sun, which is currently held in a soft, rain-induced obscurity, but by degrees of bodily exhaustion enhanced by that ever-present fear. There is more than one way to measure time. Hunger, fear, exhaustion, despair, all these things need time to develop. Hence their development marks the passage of time." Was it too philosophical, too tied up in higher thoughts? Should she not put something down to reflect her baser feelings? She pulled the pencil away from her lips and wrote, "I am cold, hungry, scared, both for myself and for my beloved, and what nightmares he's going through." Writing both sets of thoughts seemed to reinforce her, to instill some courage. They made her think of others rather than herself. She was alive, but was Thomas? There had been gunfire, reminding her inevitably of the siege of Londonderry. She had survived that, and she would survive this too. Except what of Thomas, presumably in the thick of it? She thought back to his capture. A big man with jet black hair, matched by a full beard, had grabbed Thomas from behind as he made his way to save a stranger, to drag him through the back door. Why had Thomas thrust himself into the fight that was not theirs? Why had she not insisted he leave immediately with her, striking out into the black night of the Highlands? She remembered the small round eyes of Thomas's captor, seeming out of place in his large face, accentuated by the bushy black beard. They were drill-like eyes, nothing kind about them, nothing that could see another point of view. "Run, Bridge, run," Thomas shrieked. "There must be another one," his captor shouted, the words taking a moment to settle on the others, so occupied were they in meting out death. "In the next room, I'll wager." "Go now, Bridge, run for your life." Then Bridget had seen the hilt of a long dagger strike Thomas on the side of his head, and his body had slumped to the floor. Was that to be the end of him? But why had they stunned and not killed him? She made it to the kitchen door by a hair's breadth, running into the dark morning as the hand of the first pursuer reached the doorframe. She ducked away from his grip and ran all day, stopping only to drink from streams, running much the night also, mostly uphill. She crossed over the snow line, feeling the crunchiness underfoot. In the dark, she tried to imagine the virgin white snow she was trudging through, but saw instead blood red from the slaughter that the soldiers were embarked upon, the screams of fear and desperation coming from all around. The house Thomas and she had sought shelter on the night of the 12th of February.
Sorry about that for technical issues. We seem to have lost Chris for the moment. Hopefully, Chris will come back online shortly. It's another one of those lovely things about living in rural Dorset. Unfortunately, the broadband can be a bit hit and miss Chris was saying before we went online, it's held out all this way until the very end, which is a shame because it was getting there to the very end of his first chapter of the new book that's coming out next month. I will be posting links to the book to pre-order, etc., on the Books and the Cuppa Facebook group. So please do feel free to have a look at that and consider purchasing that, because it was getting to quite an interesting finale there. I think we may well have to cut it short there. So I would like to thank Chris, and I will speak to him offline to say thank you very much. And I hope anybody that has been able to tune in will enjoy that, and anybody that catches up with us later will enjoy the talk and chat as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to be part of this session today.